Somewhere around 850,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now northern Spain, an early human picked up a sharpened stone, leaned over the body of a 2-year-old child, and calmly cut the head from the neck. Not in a rage, not in a panic, with the same steady, practiced strokes that same person used on deer and wild horses. And then they ate the child. This is the oldest solid evidence we have of humans eating humans. And here's the part that ruins dinner. It is nowhere near the last. For most of our long, weird history as a species, cannibalism was not the plot of a horror film. It was just a Tuesday. So let's figure out where this came from, why our ancestors did it constantly, and why one group of people in Papua New Guinea literally evolved a brand new gene just to survive their own funerals. The 850,000-year snack. The place is Gran Dolina, one of the caves at a site called Atapuerca in Spain, and it has given archaeologists the single oldest case of human cannibalism found anywhere on Earth. The people doing the eating belonged to a species called Homo antecessor, one of our distant ancestors, and they were not messing around. Researchers have found the bones of at least 10 of these individuals, mostly kids and teenagers, all covered in the same telltale marks. We are talking cut marks, where the meat was sliced off the bone, deliberate fractures where the bones were cracked open to scoop out the fatty marrow inside, skulls smashed to get at the brain. And the truly chilling detail is that these marks are identical to the ones on the animal bones, sitting in the exact same layer of dirt. The bison got butchered one way, the children got butchered the same way. To Homo antecessor, there was no line between food and us. We were both just meat. In 2025, the team led by Dr. Palmira Saladie announced they had found a child's neck bone, roughly 850,000 years old, with clean-cut marks showing the little one had been decapitated and processed. The kid was somewhere between 2 and 5. And before you assume this was some desperate, starving last resort, the evidence points the other way. These early humans appear to have done this routinely, possibly as a way of wiping out rival groups who wandered into their turf. Kill the neighbors, eat the neighbors, take the cave. It was territorial defense with a side of protein. Skull cups in England? Jump ahead, about 835,000 years, and we land at Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, around 14,700 years ago. And the folks living here took the whole thing to a genuinely artistic level. Archaeologists at London's Natural History Museum found the remains of at least 6 people here, including a young child, and the bones tell a full story. There are human tooth marks on the ribs, meaning actual people gnawed on these actual people. Scientists examined 164 bones and found human chewing damage on 87 of the lower body ones. The bodies were skinned, sliced, and cracked apart for marrow with real skill. But here is where Gough's Cave gets famous. 3 of the skulls were not just smashed for the brain and tossed aside. They were carefully, painstakingly shaped into cups. These folks removed the faces, cleaned out the base of the skull, and trimmed the ragged edges to turn the top of a human head into a smooth drinking bowl. Skull cups. Our ancestors were sipping out of each other's craniums roughly 15,000 years ago, and they were doing it on purpose, with craftsmanship. Dr. Sylvia Bello, who studies these bones, thinks this was not simple hunger. The remains were deposited over just 2 or 3 generations, and the team even found a human arm bone carefully engraved with a zigzag pattern. You do not decorate your leftovers. This looks like ritual, a customary way of handling the dead that happened to involve eating them and drinking from their skulls. Which brings us to a key idea for the rest of this video. The Neanderthals joined in. And before you decide this was just a weird habit of a few random human groups, let's talk about the Neanderthals, because our thick-browed cousins were right there at the table with us. At a cave called Moulin-Gercy in France, researchers found Neanderthal bones from at least 6 individuals dating back around 100,000 years. The bones showed cut marks, hammerstone blows, and cracked open shafts for the marrow, and the giveaway is that they were processed in almost exactly the same way as the red deer butchered in the very same cave. Same tools, same technique, same dinner. In a Spanish cave called El Cedrón, scientists uncovered a whole family group of Neanderthals, around a dozen of them, who met the same end roughly 49,000 years ago. Skinned, dismembered, and chewed, kids and adults alike. It gets bleaker. At a site in Goyet, Belgium, Neanderthals were not only eaten, their bones were then repurposed into tools, used to sharpen stone flakes. So your relatives got you for dinner and then used your femur as kitchen equipment. Somewhere in Germany, a Neolithic farming community at a site called Herxheim left behind the shattered, marrow-cracked remains of hundreds of people, possibly close to 1,000, their skulls trimmed into caps. Scholars still argue over whether that was cannibalism or an elaborate burial rite, but the marrow splitting really does not look like polite mourning. The point is simple. This behavior is not some rare glitch. It runs through multiple human species, across hundreds of thousands of years, on multiple continents. Eating people is arguably one of the most human things there is. Not all cannibals are equal. Because cannibalism is one word doing a lot of very different jobs, And the anthropologists who study this stuff have sorted it into a surprisingly organized menu. First, you have endocannibalism, which is eating members of your own group, your family, your tribe, your friends. This one usually shows up as a funeral custom, a way of mourning, of keeping a loved one inside you, sometimes tied to beliefs about the soul. It sounds monstrous, but to the people doing it, it was the most loving thing imaginable. Then there is exocannibalism, the opposite, which is eating outsiders and enemies. That one is about power. You beat your rival, and then you consume him, so everyone knows exactly who won. After that, you get survival cannibalism, the starvation kind, where normal people who would never dream of it are stuck in a snowbank or a lifeboat and have to make an unthinkable choice. There is nutritional cannibalism, which is just eating people as a regular food source with no drama attached, which is probably what our friends at Atapuerca were up to. And then, my personal favorite, there is medicinal cannibalism, where you eat bits of human being because you genuinely believe it will cure your headache. We are absolutely coming back to that one, because Europe has some explaining to do. For a while, there was even a serious academic argument that most cannibalism never happened at all. In 1979, anthropologist William Ahrens wrote a book claiming that man-eating was mostly a slur, a story one group told about another to make them seem like savages, and he demanded eyewitness proof. It was a fair challenge. It also got demolished by the bones, because you cannot argue with human tooth marks and a nicely carved skull cup. Blame Columbus for the word. Quick detour, because the word itself has a ridiculous origin story. Cannibal did not exist until Christopher Columbus bumbled into the Caribbean in 1492. The local people he met, the ones we now call the Kalinago, called themselves something that Columbus wrote down as Caniba. He was convinced he was near Asia, and half believed these were subjects of the Great Khan, so the name was already a mangled mess. Rumors swirled that these people ate human flesh. The name stuck to the practice, and later writers made it worse by linking caniba to the Latin word for dog, implying a dog-like hunger for meat. So the entire world's word for eating people is basically a geography error crossed with an ethnic insult invented by a man who never figured out which continent he was standing on. If you want the older, classier term, it is anthropophagy, straight from ancient Greek, meaning simply the eating of humans. Herodotus was writing about people he called the androphagi, the man-eaters, back in the 5th century BC. The Greeks had a word for this thousands of years before Columbus turned a tribe's name into a genre of horror, the kindest cannibals. Now for the centerpiece, and it is the most important story in this whole video, because it is where cannibalism, love, disease, and evolution all crash into each other. In the highlands of Papua New Guinea live a people called the Fore, and through the early 20th century, the Fore practiced what anthropologists politely call transumption. When someone died, the family did not bury them and walk away. They ate them. This was an act of profound love and respect. Better that the body be consumed by people who cared about you, they reasoned, than left to rot in the cold ground or be eaten by worms. The women and children of the community typically handled this, and they ate all of it, including the brain. And then, sometime in the 20th century, the Fore started dying of something horrifying. They called it kuru, which means to shiver or to tremble, because that is what it did to you. It started with a loss of balance and coordination. Then came the shaking. Then bursts of uncontrollable laughter, which earned it the grim nickname, the laughing sickness. Within about a year, you were dead, and it was hitting the women and children hardest, wiping out entire villages, the exact people who were eating the brains. In some Fore communities, the disease killed so many women that men outnumbered them 3-1. A generation of children was growing up without mothers, and nobody yet understood that the funerals were the cause. The tragic logic was almost perfect. A relative dies. The women lovingly eat the body, brain included, to honor them. If that person happened to carry kuru, the women get infected. Years later, they die of kuru. Their bodies get lovingly eaten at their own funerals, and the whole cycle repeats, quietly, across decades. The practice was mostly stamped out by the authorities in the late 1950s, but here is the cruel twist. Because the disease could hide in the body for so long, new cases kept popping up for another 50 years. The last stragglers of an epidemic that had technically ended before most of the victims even felt sick. The slowest killer. For years, nobody could crack it. Was it a poison? A curse? A gene? An American doctor named Carlton Gajdusek moved in, lived with the Fore, and started collecting samples. And in 1966, he did something that sounds insane. He injected infected human brain material into chimpanzees. Years later, the chimps got kuru too. It was transmissible. Something in the brains was spreading the disease, and Gajdusek won the 1976 Nobel Prize for proving it. But he got the culprit slightly wrong. He thought it was a slow virus. The real answer came from a scientist named Stanley Prusiner, who figured out the agent was not a virus at all. It was a prion. A prion is a protein, folded into the wrong shape, And it has no DNA, no RNA, nothing alive about it. It just bumps into the healthy proteins in your brain and forces them to misfold too, over and over, turning your brain into a sponge full of holes. Prusiner won his own Nobel in 1997 for that one. Kuru could hide in your body for decades, sometimes 50 years or more, which is why people kept dying long after the eating stopped. And here's the fact that should genuinely break your brain, which, given the topic, feels appropriate. Evolution fought back. The Fore did not just suffer the epidemic, they evolved during it. When British scientists studied the survivors, they found something extraordinary hiding in their DNA. A number of Fore people carried a tiny genetic variant, a single change in the prion gene that researchers named G127V. And that variant made them resistant to Kuru. People who had it could sit through the funeral feasts, eat the brains, and simply not get sick. The scientists, led by John Collinge and Simon Mead, genotyped more than 3,000 people, including over 700, who had taken part in these mortuary feasts. The pattern was unmistakable. Think about the timeline. This protective gene was rare or non-existent before the epidemic. Then a deadly disease tore through the population, killed everyone who lacked the gene, and left behind the people who had it, who then had children. In a matter of decades, the gene spread. That is natural selection happening in real time, in living human memory, driven by cannibalism. Scientists call it one of the strongest examples of recent evolution in our entire species. A group of humans ate their dead, the dead fought back with a brain-melting protein, and the humans answered by evolving a defense. If that does not make you respect the Fore, nothing will. Europe was worse. Now let's talk about the hypocrites. Because while European explorers were sailing around the globe clutching their pearls and calling other people savage cannibals, Europe itself was chugging human remains as medicine for centuries, openly, in pharmacies. This was called corpse medicine, and it peaked in the 1500s and 1600s, and the shopping list is spectacular. There was mummia, which was ground-up mummy. Yes, they imported ancient Egyptian mummies, crushed them into powder, and swallowed them to treat internal bleeding and bruises. Demand got so high that people started faking mummies out of fresh corpses to keep up. There was human fat, scraped and rendered and rubbed onto aching joints and wounds, often sold by the local executioner as a nice side hustle. There was human blood, sometimes drunk fresh and warm right at the execution scaffold, because people believed the vitality of a healthy young person passed straight into you. And there was powdered human skull, prescribed for headaches and seizures. The really fancy version involved skull moss, a moss that grew on the skulls of the unburied dead, ideally men who had been hanged and left outside. Doctors thought this was premium medicine, and wealthy customers paid a fortune for it. The freshness mattered too. Physicians of the era genuinely debated which corpses made the best medicine, often recommending the bodies of young men who had died violently and suddenly, on the theory that their trapped life force had not yet drained away. This was not folklore whispered by peasants. It was written into respectable medical textbooks and stocked on apothecary shelves right next to the herbs. The king's drops. And this was not some fringe habit for weirdos in back alleys. King Charles II of England was a fan. He was so into a particular medicine made from powdered human skull dissolved in alcohol that the recipe became known as the king's drops. He reportedly paid good money for the formula and sipped it to feel better. Let that fully sink in. The King of England was drinking a cocktail of crushed human skulls in his palace, prescribed by respectable physicians, at the exact same time European sailors were writing horrified journals about the barbaric flesh-eaters they met overseas. The historian Richard Sugg, who wrote the definitive book on all this, put it best. Europe was a continent of cannibals, loudly condemning cannibalism. The people pointing fingers had powdered skull on their breath. The Aztec argument. Which brings us to one of the biggest academic brawls in the whole field, the Aztecs. Everyone agrees the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice, and there is decent evidence some ritual cannibalism went along with it. The fight is about why. In 1977, an anthropologist named Michael Harner dropped a bombshell theory. He argued the Aztecs ate people because they were desperate for protein. His logic was that the Valley of Mexico had no big domestic animals, no cattle, no sheep, no pigs, so the population was starved for meat, and captured enemies became, in his words, walking meat. Marvin Harris took this idea and ran with it in a popular book, and suddenly the whole Aztec empire got reduced to a protein deficiency problem. Other scholars absolutely hated this. Marshall Solins tore into it, pointing out that human sacrifice for the Aztecs was drenched in religion, cosmology, and meaning. And you cannot flatten all of that into a nutrition chart. Another researcher, Bernard Ortiz de Montellano, showed the Aztecs actually had plenty of protein. They farmed intensively on floating gardens called chinampas. They ate beans and amaranth and insects. They even harvested a protein-rich algae off the lakes. And the sacrifices lined up with the harvest season, not with famine. So the modern take is this. The cannibalism was real, but they were just hungry for a burger explanation is mostly rejected. It was about the gods, not the groceries. When normal people snap, of course, sometimes it really is just about being hungry, because there is a version of cannibalism that could happen to absolutely anyone, including you, if the situation got bad enough. This is survival cannibalism, and history is full of it. The most famous American case is the Donner Party. In the winter of 1846, a group of around 87 settlers heading to California got trapped by brutal early snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They ran out of food, they ate their oxen, then their pets, then boiled hides for glue soup, and when people started dying, roughly half the survivors ate the flesh of those who had already passed. When rescuers finally got through, only about 45 of the original group were still alive. And the details are grim in a very human way. Some of the trapped settlers reportedly could not bring themselves to eat their own family members, so families quietly swapped, agreeing to eat each other's dead instead of their own. One group of survivors, a snowshoe party that set out to find help, got so lost and starved that they too resorted to it in the open wilderness. These were ordinary farmers and families with children, headed west for a better life. And within a single winter, they crossed a line most of us assume we could never cross. Then there is the story that became the movie, Alive. In 1972, a plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team crashed high in the Andes Mountains. Of the 45 people aboard, only 16 made it out, after 72 days in the snow with no food. They survived by eating their dead friends, a decision the deeply Catholic young men agonized over and compared to communion. One of those survivors, Roberto Canessa, went on to become a heart doctor. These were not monsters, they were kids who wanted to live. The whale and the ice. Two more, because they are too good to skip. In 1820, a whaling ship called the Essex was rammed and sunk in the middle of the Pacific by an angry sperm whale, a real event that inspired the novel Moby Dick. The crew drifted for months in tiny boats, and as they starved, they made the darkest possible choice. They drew lots to decide who would die to feed the others. The lot fell on a 17-year-old boy named Owen Coffin, who happened to be the captain's own cousin. Coffin accepted it, and another young crewman shot him. 8 of the 20 men survived. A boy named Coffin. History has a sick sense of humor. 4 years before that, in 1816, a French Navy ship called the Medusa ran aground off the coast of West Africa, and the officers crammed roughly 147 people onto a hastily built raft and cut it loose. Over about 13 days at sea, that raft descended into pure nightmare, with fighting, murder, and the survivors eating the dead to stay alive. When rescue arrived, only around 15 people were still breathing. The horror was so total that a young painter named Theodore Géricault turned it into an enormous, haunting masterpiece called The Raft of the Medusa, which still hangs in the Louvre today. People line up to admire a beautiful painting of the exact moment human beings realized they were going to have to eat each other. And then the Franklin expedition. In 1845, 129 British men sailed into the Arctic to find a northern sea passage and vanished completely. For years, Victorian England refused to believe the Inuit accounts that the starving crew had eaten each other. Charles Dickens himself angrily denied it. But the bones do not lie. Modern researchers found cut marks on about a quarter of the recovered remains, plus something called pot polishing, the smooth shine bones get when they are boiled in a pot to squeeze out the last of the marrow. That is the final stage of starvation cannibalism. And in 2024, DNA finally identified one of the eaten men as Captain James Fitzjames, a senior officer. Rank did not save you. When the food runs out, everyone is on the menu. Even the animals do it. And if it makes you feel any better about our species, we are far from the only ones who snack on our own kind. Nature is absolutely covered in cannibals. The most famous example is the praying mantis, where the female sometimes bites the head off the male during mating and eats him. Contrary to the myth, she does not always do this, and it turns out hungry females are the ones most likely to make a meal of their partner, which is a relationship red flag if there ever was one. Even weirder is the Australian redback spider, where the male actively somersaults his own body into the female's jaws mid-mating. He is not being ambushed. He is volunteering. Getting eaten buys him more time to fertilize her eggs and father more babies, so evolution rewards the guy who turns himself into a post-coital snack. Fish eat their own eggs. Scorpions eat each other. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, have been filmed killing and eating infants of their own kind. Cannibalism is not some bizarre human perversion. It is a common, boring, wildly successful strategy all over the tree of life. We are just the only ones who feel bad about it and write essays. It's in your genes. So here is the thought to leave you with, and it is a genuinely unsettling one. All of this eating, across 850,000 years and every inhabited continent, may have left a mark inside your own body. In 2003, The same scientists who cracked the Fore mystery looked at the prion gene in around 1,000 people from all over the world, and they found signs of the same protective evolution, the same balancing act in the DNA, in basically every population on Earth. Their conclusion was that cannibalism, and the brain diseases it caused, were probably so common in our ancient past that humans everywhere evolved partial resistance to them. The finding is debated, but the implication is wild. The reason your DNA looks the way it does might partly be that your distant ancestors, somewhere down the line, ate other people and survived the consequences. We like to think of cannibalism as the ultimate taboo, the one line no normal person would ever cross. But the bones, the caves, the skull cups, the king's medicine cabinet, and possibly your own genome all whisper the same uncomfortable truth. For most of the human story, eating people was not the exception. It was completely, casually normal. We are the weird ones for stopping, and your ancestors, statistically speaking, would have found your squeamishness adorable.